much, Joshua. And I want to say thank you to everybody for being here. I know it's a challenging time of the year to attend talks and that kind of stuff. As I was saying to Joshua, I'm really excited to be here and involved with the cultural studies program. So the program that I'm involved with at Laurier is actually the Department of Communication and Cultural Studies, and there's not a lot of Canadian cultural studies programs across this country. So it's always such a pleasure to be able to speak to students and faculty who are thinking through what it means to be a cultural studies scholar in the Canadian context. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited, and I'm really excited about what I'm talking about today too. So let me share my screen. And if anything goes wrong, you can't hear me, or it's you can't see what I'm projecting on the screen, just let me know. I've asked if Joshua will sort of monitor the chat for me, because I'm kind of bad at doing that. And if you have questions as I go, please just interrupt me. I'm really happy to talk about this stuff. I'm going to start with my land acknowledgement, and I want to say that I'm speaking specifically from the Haldeman Tract, which is the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral Nations. And I'm acknowledging this just as one step in a greater process of accountability to and solidarity with the people of the First Nations. So this is the title of my talk, Talking to Covidiots, a cultural studies approach to a communicative practice. And there is a lot to unravel in the title of this talk. So to start, I want to first think about who Covidiots are. What are defining characteristics? I'm going to ask then, where might we find Covidiots? Is it in our everyday interactions, in news, in marches, in protests, or in other moments of collective action? And I'm also curious about the when of the Covidiot. What is the historicity, the layers of past moments that have become sedimented into the figure of the Covidiots? And finally, I want to ask, why is talking to them something that we do? I'm going to come back to this particular figure, this particular woman, later in the talk. Is talking to Covidiots something that we should do or something to avoid? And I'm going to try to situate these questions about the who, what, when, where, and why of the Covidiot within a critical cultural studies framework, one that seriously pop culture and the way in which it mediates themes of resistance, interpolation, embodiment, and appropriation. I also work within a framework that takes up Nick Coldry's call to expand the boundaries of cultural studies, and that intersects with the work of scholars in decolonial studies. And finally, I work within a framework that takes seriously the role of religion in contemporary culture. I'm interested in religion both as it overtly intersects with the figure of the Covidiot and in the more covert ways in which it's encoded in everyday discourse and practice. So these sources are just sort of hinting at those frameworks. There's other people outside of Nick Coldry and Walter McNolo who deal with the boundaries of cultural studies and decolonial studies, obviously. But I'm going to try to put lots of sources here because I know when I was a student that I wanted to see lots of sources. It was always interesting to me. So I'm doing all of this, thinking about the Covidiot myself as a pandemic subject. So I want to think about what that means. It's probably going to be obvious as I talk that I have qualms and concerns about this term that is the very focus of my talk, the Covidiot. It may become obvious as I talk that I think the term Covidiot bleeds assumptions and leaks signifiers of a host of associated concepts and ideologies, which include ideas of health and medicine, individuality, freedom and democracy, discovery and science, belonging, citizenship and care, and bodies that are at least racialized, classed, and gendered. I think on top of that, the Covidiot also bleeds anxieties, not just about actual viruses, but about the very ways we relate to and interact with one another in this thing that we call a culture. In the long view, I hope that this talk intersects with ongoing discussions about how we talk to each other in the context of what a lot of people sort of talk about as increasing polarizations in all aspects of our lives. I'm going to note briefly, this is my little methodology section, that I'm limiting the scope of this inquiry to the Anglophone world where the Covidiot makes a certain type of sense. And I'm largely focusing even more narrowly on North America. And I'm doing that in part because I want to explore the relationship of the figure of the Covidiot to North American brands of neoliberalism, libertarianism, individualism, and democracy. Now, this doesn't negate the need for a global approach to understanding similar emergent figures and languages in a transnational context. I'm also evoking stories of Covidiots, so particular stories of them. And there's some of them are Covidiots that I've encountered. And some of these encounters are mediated, and I'll come back to those, and recounted through the media, and some are a bit more personal. In each case, however, every story that I share has been publicly circulated in some way. And I try to preserve people's identities where I'm able. So let's start at the beginning then. Who are Covidiots? Covidiot is obviously a portmanteau of COVID and idiot. The Macmillan Dictionary, the relatively similar definitions of the term. It's probably easiest to say that the Covidiot is conduct during the COVID-19 pandemic. This can, as the dictionary definition tells us, include public health rules and guidelines like masking and social distancing and getting vaccinated, but it also includes more abstract rules of social conduct. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Covidiot was the person that was hoarding toilet paper. A Covidiot may be someone who doesn't believe the COVID-19 virus is real. And the term seems sometimes to apply to anyone who occupies a certain religious identity, with evangelical or conservative Christians, and that term itself is pretty broad and unwieldy, perhaps being the largest single group to be branded Covidiot. And in part, they're branded that way because they fit other criteria, including vaccine refusal or skepticism, mask refusal, and refusal to abide by lockdown regulations. Even a cursory exploration of articles written about Covidiots reveal that the term discursively overlaps with a dozen of other terms, such as anti-vaxxer, anti-masker, and very often is linked concretely to those spreading, but also believing what we sort of blithely label misinformation. If we broaden the figure of the Covidiot to include all of these, we find that Covidiots span a variety of social positions, from stay-at-home mom to doctor. If you're not familiar with Dr. Patrick Phillips, he's Canadian, he's worth looking up. From white Westerner to immigrant, from gay men to tattoo artists, from athletes to small business owners. My goal here is not to outline an exhaustive study of the demographics of people who could fall under the rubric of the Covidiot. Instead, I'm seeking to illuminate how this figure circulates in and out of discourse and how it gets embodied in the actual lived experiences of subjects. I'm really curious about the cultural work that the Covidiot performs. I'm also interested in the performance of hand-wringing when it comes to vaccination rates, mask wearing, social distancing, or any other public health policy with which some citizens fail to comply. This, Brian Lim points out, is how pandemic subjects have been separated into good coronavirus citizens who is able to act in the interest of others, and the Covidiot. So we'll talk a lot about the difference between a good citizen and a bad citizen. Hand-wringing is both performative and virtual singing, and serves to demonize, and I'm not using that term lightly, the Covidiot. More finely tuned definitions of Covidiots, and those in line with a type of theorizing of hegemony and ideology as it intersects with subjectivity, alterity, and marginalization that is so common to critical cultural studies, will acknowledge that there are those who do not have the financial resources or the personal conditions that might allow them to stay home, to avoid hoarding, or to social distance, or even to get vaccinated. So we do have that acknowledgement, and Chris Griffin is one person who acknowledges this, and in that acknowledgement, he focuses his definition of Covidiots on, as he says, the recalcitrant free spirits who seem to imagine themselves at the avant-garde of a new form of civil disobedience. Brazenly flouting government advice, a conspicuous few simply refuse to cease partying, gathering, and surfing. So for Griffin, these individuals could follow the rules, but don't. So there's that distinction now with the Covidiot between the ones who don't have a choice and the ones who do. Griffin's definition raises the concept of civil disobedience and freedom, and then that's going to haunt this analysis, I think. Freedom, the anti-Covidiot crowd will argue, is something that must be curtailed during a pandemic, otherwise people will get sick and they will die. Lurking beneath almost all responses to the recalcitrant free spirit of the Covidiot is the realization that any of us, pandemic subjects, can be turned into unknowing but lethal agents, and any of us can be turned into unknowing receptors of that lethality. Of course, Covidiot is a fluid subject position. One can move from bad to good pandemic subject. So this is one of my favorite guys. This is Brian Slutter, and he was a 22-year-old on spring break in Miami, and he said, if I get corona, I get corona. And he received a huge amount of social media condemnation. And so he later apologized. This is the communicative praxis of the pandemic. How we talk about the virus categorizes us into good or bad pandemic citizens. It is undeniably good and noble to want to protect not only ourselves, but others. It is also undeniably rooted in privilege. So writing in the time before the vaccines, so before before vaccines were available, Brian Lim talks about the ways in which gay men negotiated COVID while maintaining the pandemically risky behavior of sexual intimacy with multiple people. And Lim tells us that his gay Covidiots, that's his phrase, refused to sacrifice the present for a future in which COVID-19 is rendered non-threatening. They enact a temporality of the here and now, which allows them to attend to the liveness of the virus as question, as more than something to be managed out of existence. So Lim's subjects engaged in risky behavior. They didn't believe that COVID-19 didn't exist. They didn't believe that they weren't engaging in risky behavior. So they weren't that category of Covidiot, right? They believe that the virus exists. They believe it was dangerous, but they still engaged in the behavior. And I think that becomes important, or an important frame for how we think about the Covidiot moving forward. As we learn that there's probably not going to be an easy end to the pandemic or to ourselves as pandemic subjects, how we live and relate to each other in a time of COVID seems to be an urgent question. In Pennsylvania and Dutch country, Amish communities continue to live communally, eating and working and attending church together, often with very minimal mask wearing and social distancing. And they continue to do that to this day. Due to an established suspicion of English medicine, the Amish have not submitted to COVID testing. So in other words, we don't know what the rates of infection are in the Amish community. But it is suspected that rates of COVID infection and death are really high in that community, while vaccine uptake is estimated to be at 1% in Pennsylvania Dutch Amish communities at the moment. This renders the Amish bad COVID subjects. Now, the Amish religion itself does not necessarily advocate refusing vaccines or medical care, but it does suggest that God's will should assume primacy when it comes to illness and death. Fighting illness does not always make sense in this worldview. More importantly, the Amish value their communal existence over and above everything else. I don't think that's too great of a statement to make. The idea of an Amish elder dying alone in isolation in the hospital of the English is abhorrent and a fate worse than death itself. So like Lim's gay Covidiots, the Amish valorize the here and now, making choices about illness and death that are not dependent on the futurity of much COVID discourse, and that drives the preferred behavior of the pandemic citizen following public health guidelines. The Amish, of course, are part of the settler-colonialism of America. So this is William Penn, who, is given the title of founder of Pennsylvania. And some of the first Amish communities arrived in the 18th century, and they were arriving, escaping religious persecution in Europe and taking up William Penn's promise of religious freedom. So freedom is central to a lot of Covidiot discourse. In Canada, freedom rallies, also called walks for freedom and Jericho freedom marches, have been organized, sometimes by religious authorities, and they've seen the participation of elected politicians. This is Randy Hillier, MPP. So although citing Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedom, so that's what the freedom marches do, they sort of say, according to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedom, we shouldn't have to mask, social distance, lockdown, all of that kind of stuff. Freedom rallies actually evoke a much longer history of the idea of freedom in settler colonial spaces, and they become another response to the figure of the Covidiot. Freedom marchers are really easily labeled Covidiots. They often occupy positionalities of whiteness and conservativeness, and they clearly eschew social responsibility. Moreover, they often disbelieve COVID-19 itself. They argue that the virus is not real, the pandemic response a vast conspiracy, vaccines are corrosive and probably coercive, right? That's their big argument. And the rest of us, how do they think about the rest of us? Well, they think we're sheep, unaware of all of the above. The response to these theories from good pandemic citizens is not so much the hand-wringing I talked about before as head shaking. It's an incredulity that these people refuse to understand the science, that they once again give in to misinformation. So I wrote in this article about a woman interviewed by CNN's Gary Tuchman, who said she was covered in Jesus's blood, something that would protect her from the COVID-19 virus. And the reason that she, so being covered in Jesus's blood was the reason that she gave for confidently attending church with other people, for going to Walmart and Home Depot. When the interview went viral, which it did, the woman's discourse was the subject of much righteous head shaking. How could she believe something mystical would protect her from a virus? How dangerous was her belief? I argued that the conditions of modern medical science means that for me and most non-scientists, the mechanism of belief spans both religious and non-religious praxis. A woman covered in Jesus's blood in a church parking lot is choosing to believe one authority figure, her pastor, while I, a different kind of pandemic subject, chooses to believe another, a public health official. So I wash my hands, I wear a mask, I get vaccinated. Without the skills to evaluate scientific information myself, I believe the science, while the woman in the church parking lot believes instead in the efficacy of Jesus. But belief is functioning similarly in both cases. Religious studies scholar Bob Orsi also wrote about this same woman, which is, you saw her at the beginning here. And Orsi's she was really a compelling figure, I think, for those of us who think about religion. Orsi's short piece of public scholarship is a really painful negotiation of his decades-long work to take seriously popular religion and its practitioners, and his own position as a pandemic subject who finds this woman, to quote, absolutely terrifying. So Orsi's approach to religion has been something he calls plural ontological realism, or to simplify, that acknowledgement that people believe different things about reality. And it's a really valuable approach to take when trying to understand popular religious worlds. But it gets complex when it's understood in relation to ethical responsibility, morality, or issues of shared concern in a public sphere. I'd like to momentarily bracket ethics, morality, and publics to focus on the idea of belief. And I'm going to come back to those ideas of ethics and morality. And I'm more specifically interested in how belief gets tied up in notions of freedom, nations, and even science itself. Ideas of freedom and liberty are part and parcel of how we define Western democracy, and they keep getting reiterated. Religious liberties, charters of rights and freedoms, constitutional freedoms are constantly evoked and re-evoked. All of these, however, are framed by a democracy built on colonialism and slavery. Now, this is not a politically correct aside, but it is central to how democracy works. As Achille Mbembe explains through the idea of necropolitics, a condition in which social contestation is neutralized through the systemic control, imprisonment, and extermination of populations inside and outside of the state. This subjugation of life to the power of death is at the root of Western democracy and modernity that believes in freedom while occupying nations are built on the systemic unfreedom of slavery and the genocide of colonialism. But what does all of this have to do with Covidiots? Well, Ralph Bauer, in The Alchemy of Conquest, takes us to the early part of what we call modernity, digging up the roots of the narrative of America as a place to discover. We hear this in language, so we hear it in the doctrine of discovery, the age of discovery, but we also, Bauer explains, find it in narratives of scientific advancement. Bauer points out that before the 17th century, America was not depicted as a tabula rasa, but as sites of the knowledge of others. As the story of discovery took hold, it not only overwrote the knowledges of others, cementing this overwriting in conquest, law, and religion, but it also entangled science with the language of discovery. Tracing his inquiry to 13th century Christian appropriation of Islamic Aristotelian alchemy, Bauer argues that the push to discover nature's secrets found in medieval Christianity legitimized the epistemic and scientific discovery of America and fueled everything from agriculture to the gold rush. And it's really interesting to think about the gold rush in relation to Bauer's idea of alchemy. Bauer's analysis reminds us that the colonization of North America both aligns with and is reinforced by Western scientific modernity. Neither the figure of the Covidiot nor the head shaker nor the hand wringer is divorced from this history. When we shake our heads at Covidiots for their misunderstanding of science and their susceptibility to misinformation, we tend to be simplifying a complex ecology of knowledge, circulation, social networks, and cultural discourse. Critical cultural studies, with its long focus on unmasking hegemonic positions, is well suited to questioning appeals to science and rationality. Head shaking around science and believing in it tends to evoke what Sandra Harding has called an internalist epistemology, where the success of modern science is ensured by its internal features. So experimental method or scientific method, science standards for maximizing objectivity, and using mathematics to express nature's laws. This is what Harding calls internalist science. In this context, science is singular, not plural. Belief in it is supposed to be absolute. Now, there's been a long history since Sandra wrote, and also prior to Sandra's writing, of questioning this idea of science. And so in many ways, it's not new, and problematizing this internalist epistemology. But this idea of science as absolute still haunts both science studies, so you still find it in critical studies of science and in popular discourse, and that's of course where I'm interested in it. And scientists themselves very often evoke this internalist discourse or internalist epistemology in public discourse, and especially in bids for funds. So when science starts to ask for money, you often hear that internalist discourse. And probably they do it because it's a convincing narrative. And I think because many scientists believe that even if internalist features are insufficient within scientific inquiry, one should still try to produce what Harding says, how Harding says it, scientific information in which one can find no culturally distinctive interests or discursive resources that of the societies that have produced the research. So they acknowledge that you can't have this internalist epistemology and have useful science, but they still say, well, that's really what we should be aspiring to. In other words, science should try as much as possible to free itself of culture where apparently bias and inequity live. One of the challenges public health officials faced during the pandemic was, was the durability of the internalist singular narrative of science. Citizens expressed frustration with the changing messages around masking and outdoor activities. Responding to this frustration, a host of experts explained in media reports and on social media that science is an evolving compendium. But even when explaining this, experts often revert back to the discourses of absolutism, reminding us of the early modern impetus of discovery. So this is the ever cranky deGrasse Tyson, and he says in this article, so you can see in the slide there that he says schools should teach science as an evolving process, not a series of hard facts. So great, that sounds like we're not falling for the internalist epistemology. But then later he says, science is a means of discovering nature. And when we have had enough experiments and enough observations, only then can we say, this is how nature behaves, whether you like it or not. And that's when science contributes to what is objectively true in the world. And so we're back to that absolutism. Harding argues that science is best understood as plural rather than singular, and as part of a debate that questions the way in which science has been positioned within Europe and Western modernities. Instead of a singular objective science, Harding suggests that we should explore what kind of sciences we have had and have now. What kinds can we get? And what kinds could or should we want? Says Harding, this is a critique of science that also critiques the ways in which knowledge of the other are categorized as pre-logical thought, superstitions or pseudosciences, folk explanations, or ethnosciences that are embedded in religious, anthropomorphic, and other local belief systems. And in the history of Western scientific discovery, such categories are either dismissed, so superstition or folk explanations are dismissed. When they're not dismissed, they're posited as precursors to true science. And interestingly enough, we get exactly that discourse when we think of the history of vaccines. Sometimes when you look up the history of vaccines, you're going to hear about it as starting in 1796 with British scientist Edward Jenner's use of cowpox to protect patients from smallpox. But it doesn't start there. It starts in China, where the practice of grinding smallpox matter into dust that was then blown into the nose predates the 1500s, or in India, where it's unclear how many were saved by similar variolation practices in the 1525 smallpox epidemic. So it starts outside of the West. In colonial discourse, variolation is referred to as primitive, folk, superstition, all language that marginalizes and marks variolation apart from the true medicine of the West. Vaccines like the smallpox vaccine are framed in Western discourses of discovery, and if you'll forgive my radically abbreviated timeline, they're rolled through the patent medicine era of US history into what we have now, which is privatized, neoliberalist systems of vaccine or medical research and creation that largely locates vaccine creation in the West and sets up conditions of, frankly, vaccine apartheid. In this context, it becomes really tempting to find in the figure and discourse of the Covidiot a critique of science and neoliberalism in particular. And this intersects with the anti-vaxxer. And the Covidiot often cites discursively natural immunity as preferable to vaccines. This idea of nature as it intersects with ideas of health is a powerful concept. Eulabis's work explains that the word implies a medicine that is untroubled by human limitations, contrived wholly by nature or God, or perhaps intelligent design. The idea that vaccines are artificial and therefore not natural is neither the sole domain of Covidiots, nor is it particularly new. There have been anti-vaccine protests as long as there have been public vaccine campaigns and mandates, with protests in the early 1800s of the US National Vaccine Agency and vaccine mandates for school children. That's just one example. And vaccines are intrusive. They make forays into healthy bodies. That's the point. You're supposed to get vaccinated when you are healthy. They seat themselves in science and empiricism that the Covidiot notes is fallible and rooted in capitalism. Anti-vaxxers often evoke the figure of big pharma as a reason to distrust vaccines. Anti-COVID vaxxers circulate reports and documents outlining legitimately bad behavior by for-profit pharmaceutical companies. So right now in circulation is this one about Pfizer having to pay $2.3 billion because it misled the public about pain medication. It is to them, to the Covidiots, hypocritical to demand that they submit to a vaccine for the greater good when that same vaccine is created by companies that have undermined the greater good, and they have a point. But that concept of nature, of natural immunity, is rooted in something powerful, a nostalgia, a yearning for a past that is constructed as a simpler time, but that is clearly linked to colonialism. Reading Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie like a how-to manual, some anti-vaxxers who were anti-vax before COVID are also homeschooling homesteaders who embrace nature or the natural in particular ways. Homesteading, for instance, is constructed both as healthy and natural and as a way of inoculating oneself against the precarity of global supply chain issues. Along with this valorization of that which is constructed as natural, and it is a construct, is a distrust of big government and the regulations that go along with it. So we're back to freedom. Anti-vax discourse that is fearful of big pharma is only one part of a more pervasive belief that Western medical institutions keep real cures secret from the public so that they may profit from the public's suffering and death. Sounds a little bit like necropolitics. And Trump tapped into this really clearly. It was so interesting to me when in his rallies that he would actually say in his rallies that US doctors make money when people get sick and die from COVID. And Trump's language was just the tip of the iceberg of the libertarian belief that argues against any form of regulation, environmental regulation, health and safety regulation, worker safety regulation, because any of these regulations could be seen as impinging on individual rights. When people die in high enough numbers, the Trumpists of the world will argue, the unseen hand of the market will adjust and eventually correct the situation. And so we find ourselves back at necropolitics. Trump may have been deposed, but he was, after all, only a symptom. In this context, lockdowns make no sense because preserving life at the expense of capital makes no sense. So this is back to Orsi's, there are different beliefs existing in the world and they don't always agree with each other. A history in which Western science and medicine is complicit, is incalculably complicit, and COVID-19 demonstrates this in microcosm. So we can look at a particular case. African Americans, for instance, experience among the highest rates of death and complications from the virus, rates much higher than whites, even when the risks are similar. So very often that's dismissed because they must live in poverty or they're taking more risks when they go to work. But even if the risks are similar, those rates of death are still higher. So even if you have to work or live in close contact across races, the rates are still higher in African Americans. And I'm using African Americans specifically because the data is less clear in the Canadian context. Early on, obesity surfaces as an explanation for the differential, and it was reported on by mainstream media quite a bit. Sabrina String questions this correlation. And again, I'm not interested in evaluating the science per se, but Strings makes a compelling argument when she observes that promoting strained association, so she doesn't agree that there's there's good science here, between race, body size, and complications from this little understood disease has served to reinforce an image of Black people as wholly swept up in sensuous pleasures like eating and drinking, which supposedly makes our unruly bodies repositories of preventable weight-related illness. Even if they wear masks, social distance, and get vaccinated, Black citizens struggle to reach the status of good pandemic citizens. And this is because String argues it's not obesity, it's slavery that underlines how subjects get cared for or not, and how they get to care about others. Demonizing uncompliant citizens ignores a history of tension between civil responsibility and individuality that structures Western democracy and that has come to saturate contemporary culture. Van der Riel and Papakarisi explain, we now talk, live, and breathe in a world of civic extremes. Every gesture must fit one of our binaries. Polarization is inevitable when we move in linear directions demarcated by left and right. We create, reinforce, and reproduce the binaries that divide us. The rigidity of binary life is completely unsurprising in the context of colonialist democracy that is at its foundation religious. If we were, for example, to really take Christian evangelicism seriously as a cultural force instead of dismissing it, we might see that religious ideas about good and bad subjects, purity and pollution, salvation and damnation have been indelibly transcribed onto the supposedly secular culture. The polarization, the rush to judgment, and the demonization of those failing to act civilly are enmeshed in material and discursive practices that did not spring forth fully formed at the advent of social media, but instead have their roots in Christian cultures of settler society. For example, embedded in Christian evangelicism is a tension between divinity and damnation. Now, these aren't passive positions. You don't just get to be divine or damned, but you have to be active in seeking divinity. So the evangelical must actively and perpetually choose divinity. Falling from grace leads to rejection and ostracization, while being saved leads to the embrace of community. The parallels of this to the supposedly secular cancel culture that we see all around us, or call out culture, are pretty unmistakable. Individuals are reduced to public performances that are conflated with then identity. Celebrities and others can fall from grace, facing social media ostracization, rejection, or boycotts, and others can find salvation, again through the public performance of specific discourse. They must perform being saved or sorry. And so that brings us back to that 22-year-old Brian Slutter who said, if I get corona, I get corona, and then had to apologize, right? So this is the performance of falling from grace and being saved, divinity and damnation. Pointing out the similarities of cancel culture to the role of holy judgment found in evangelical religion is not in any way to deny the important cultural work performed by those calling out racisms and sexisms and homophobias, for example, in various digital public spheres. But ignoring the religiosity roiling underneath praxis found in North American pop culture can undermine an analysis that seeks to explore how polarization works to cement seemingly unpopular or unacceptable social positions. In the context of a polarized public performance of identity, we need to ask, what are the mechanisms for changing one's mind? If being an anti-vaxxer becomes tied to self-identity and also to connection with others, community, and networks, what would the incentive be for switching sides? And if one's position is discursively shaded as one of salvation or damnation and the rejection that comes with it, what are the possible motivations for changing one's mind? So I have a tattoo on my left arm and that tattoo was the site of my COVID-19 vaccine. And while my peers were happily sharing pictures of their jab sites, I looked at mine with disease. I do have a picture of it, but I'm actually uncomfortable to even share it here. The tattoo into which the vaccine was plunged was completed by Damien, a successful and award-winning self-employed tattoo artist. Damien's business was shut down at the beginning of the pandemic and remained shut for 11 months, with period additional such shutdowns due to pandemic measures. The cost of this was devastating. Damien and his partner lost their home. Damien's partner was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She has since passed, and Damien now lives alone in an off-grid, not fully winterized dwelling in rural Ontario. At the beginning of the pandemic, Damien sought solutions to the shutdown that was devastating his life. First, in the concept of natural immunity, offering as a healthy person to contract and share the virus with other healthy people. 2 weeks of illness, he reasoned, would be worth the subsequent ability to return to work. Later in the pandemic, after failed attempts to get significant government financial support, Damien's distrust of a government that had caused him personal harm had grown. He was suspicious of everything mandated by provincial or federal governments, be it lockdowns, masking, social distancing, or eventually vaccines. Damien is an immigrant to Canada, arriving from the UK when he was a child. He lived in poverty for the first portion of his life, and he's a graduate of OCAD before it was a university. He's educated far beyond his art and design degree. In communiques about his experience, which he has made public, he quotes Baudrillard unselfconsciously. I hold his story very carefully, sharing it here only because Damien himself has shared this and more in various public spheres. In the world of civic extremes, Damien is a bad pandemic subject, a Covidiot even. But when I hold his story next to that of Lim's gay Covidiots or the Amish's refusal to die in isolation, Damien's story reminds me of the first of the harshness of the harshness of the pandemic public health measures on private citizens. And it also reminds me that caring for life in the context of necrophilic democracy is a losing battle. In an effort to elude the future deaths of COVID, an already stretched healthcare system puts on hold diagnostic services. Damien's partner died, and this is acknowledged, because their cancer was not caught until it advanced to stage 4 after diagnostic appointments were postponed indefinitely. And I think I'm mad about that. And then there's the story of Kim, a homeschooling mom of South Asian descent in my community. Kim is mother to a medically fragile 14-year-old child who has negative reactions to vaccines in the past. Kim was told that the mRNA vaccine would be safe for her child's condition, but didn't want to take the risk of getting her son vaccinated. She was told that doctors couldn't guarantee that the vaccine would be 100% safe, but that the risks of adverse effects were negligible. Kim thought about it for a while, and then she began to hear about myocarditis in some vaccinated teens. It was a side effect that had never been mentioned by her son's doctors. In public discourse, Kim moved from a pretty moderate position, and I'll put moderate in quotations, that acknowledged the reality and dangers of COVID and the role of vaccines in mitigating those dangers, to one where she publicly decried vaccine mandates and restrictions. Kim herself was vaccinated, but she forcefully decried the lack of medical freedom she saw mandates and restrictions complicit in. As a cultural studies scholar, it is not my job to evaluate the science of vaccines. Instead, I want to focus on how identity is performed, constituted, and cemented by discourse. The move from what seems like a moderate position to a so-called radical one is something Kim did in the context of a culture of civic extremes and a network of homeschool moms who participate in a discourse that valorizes natural cures. By making an individual choice not to vaccinate her son, she was lumped in with anti-vaxxers and Covidiots, so she might as well join them. I think I understand that. From cancel culture and call out culture to the dog whistles of politicians, these polarizations in their practices, the way in which individuals are asked to commit to ideas and then come to define them and their connections to others, get tied to identity that gets publicly performed. Never mind that calling someone a Covidiot is unproductive in terms of securing greater compliance with public health measures. I had a citation for that, but I forgot to put it in the slideshow. Entrenched judgment of burgeoning and new categories of others is deeply ingrained in our society. And don't get me wrong, Covidiots are full of judgment and condemnation too. It goes both ways. Fennings is a store. What happened there? Fennings is a store in my neighborhood. The owners have posted signs on their front doors stating that all are welcome and have told reporters that they won't be asking why customers are not wearing masks in their store. The store was fined by the Ministry of Labor, but not for their signs. Instead, they were fined because employees were observed not social distancing. The owners have been interviewed by conservative rebel media. Inside, Fennings also has a growing wall of posters, photos, and cartoons that clearly align with precepts of Covidiots, suggesting that the virus is a media-produced hoax. The anti-mask language also co-opts the language of inclusivity and safe spaces that have been key to the structural organization of disenfranchised groups. Fennings is, of course, a health food store, a particular category of commercial enterprise that trades in ideas of nature, the natural, and the organic. Long before the pandemic, one of the owners warned me about the dangers of fluoride in toothpaste. This is the domain of alternative health. The terminology of alternative health is what Nicola Gale calls a present absence. Health has to be alternative to something. And in this case, the unspoken present absence is Western biomedicine. Alternative health is rooted in early resistance to medical systems that fail for a whole host of reasons. Alternative health, Ruth Barkan notes, suggests a culture in which one can find an increasing skepticism about and resistance to authority, including medical authority, a crisis in the legitimation of scientific knowledge, a reaction against the perceived rationalism of late modernity, including both a nostalgic yearning for a supposedly simpler and more natural past, and a utopian longing for a redemptive future, a rise in individualism, and an interest in holistic thought, as well as the rise of the body as an object of self-management. Like the Amish, Lim's gay Covidiots, and Trump's libertarianisms, public health guidelines make little sense within the framework of alternative health. But unlike the stories of Damien and Kim, I feel less empathy for the store owners of Fennings. As far as I know, theirs is not a personal tragedy, but a commercial one, if that. And there's something about this story that makes me squirm. So what do I do critically with this empathy or lack of it? What do I do with my varying anger, understanding, and feelings of squirm when it comes to these stories in which individuals could be defined as Covidiots, with all that this analysis implies that means? In Against Empathy, David Bloom argues that empathy is a bad predictor or technology of moral behavior, even if it sometimes does produce good results. Bloom suggests that we should skip over empathetic dictates like love your neighbor and move to what is really beneath such empathetic dictates, which is don't kill your neighbor. It's not our empathy that needs developing, suggests Bloom, but our rights. With more rights, we end up with a better moral world, one in which we don't kill our neighbors. But a discussion of rights brings us back to our discussion of freedoms and the hypocrisy that underpins them. Another approach to critical empathy perhaps could be found in a feminist ethics of care, which, if we trace it back to Carol Gilligan's original conception of that concept, suggests that we substitute care and responsibility in relationships for rights and rules. A valid criticism of my approach is that it does not address the real harm happening to those not defined as Covidiots by those defined as Covidiots. Threats to healthcare workers, often laden with racism and sexism, are one of only many situations in which the discourse of anti-vaxxers and medical freedom seekers intersecting with discourses of white supremacy and individualism gets weaponized. It's an important critique, but talking about the ways in which the Covidiot gets discursively constructed does not, in my opinion, preclude thinking about harm and violence. For me, as someone interested in thinking about social justice more broadly and health justice more specifically, the solution is never to turn away from the ways in which subjects are socially constructed, represented, identified, and how they perform identity, but to try and understand how these processes of identification intersect with material and immaterial infrastructures that open up some possibilities or choices while limiting others. So I'm ending not with a definitive outline of what a covidiot is or means or where it could be found. Instead, I end by suggesting that tracing the covidiot through the history of democracy and discovery, settler colonialism, libertarianism, a milieu of civic extremes, and the constructions of science, medicine, alternative health, and nature itself is an act worth doing. Early on in the study of epidemiology, the epidemiology of outbreaks, scientists learned that you cannot focus on a virus or a bacteria, but must also understand the environments in which they flourish. Disease, the West learns, is part of a chain of interlinking events that include not only the birth and circulation of microbes, but the environments of their hosts. The covidiot is less a disease, I think, than a symptom contracted from a network of impossibly connected arteries, all of which have to be understood as a whole to make sense of a cure. Thank you. Why don't I stop sharing this now? I can see people better.
Okay, wow, my God, there's so much there. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna maybe offer people a moment for questions. I have like 1,000 questions here, but I mean, I really like the paper insofar as you're attempting not to humanize the covidiot, but maybe to contextualize the covidiot in certain ways. And I'm curious about like something that's sort of lurking in your paper, which is addressed in many different ways, but not directly, is like the culture war. Like there's like a culture war that's happening over COVID, but also more broadly speaking. And I think one of the things that I really take from your paper, which I really enjoy, is that, you know, you've situated it in terms of like competing modernities, insofar as you've talked about settler colonialism and the sort of the rise of the modern state and how these perspectives have been directly informed by those histories. And I mean, it seems to me that depending on what side of the spectrum you fall on, all of the sort of dichotomies that you've referenced, like good and bad, or belief in science, or inequity and privilege, become sort of re-articulated in different ways. But ultimately, it's like those competing modernities come from like a singular source in a way. So this is how I'm thinking about your paper in relation to something that I've been thinking about, which is like, I'm really curious about the left critique of the left, if that makes any sense. And I've been, you know, listening to this podcast, which I, you know, love and hate at the same time, the Red Scare podcast. And it's like these, you know, these two women who are, you know, supposedly from the left, but they ultimately come up with these very libertarian conclusions. And so anyway, I'm just curious about maybe just a way to like personify some of like the many different things you brought through. I'm curious about like villains of the right, you know, like Fauci or AOC, or like these sorts of characters or caricatures almost. Yeah, I'm just curious about how to situate them in relation to some of the broader contextual things that you've brought forward. Because I mean, I feel critical of Fauci and AOC, but I don't know, I don't have a language actually, to, you know, to situate that, because, you know, I myself identify as somebody on the left. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about those two?
Yeah, I'll say, I think you hit it right on. It's that this idea of contested modernity is certainly underlying what I'm trying to get at. And I'll be just frank, this is fairly emergent research in some ways for me. I've definitely been thinking about the ideas of modernity. So I used to work on Haiti. And so definitely ideas of modernity and the birth of democracy and what's unwritten in the stories of Western democracy has been central to my work for a really long time. So I'm pulling that forward, but talking about it in the context of this particular subject, which, as you point out, yeah, I'm talking specifically about Covidiots, but essentially I'm more interested in this larger polarization, culture wars that is going on right now, is new for me. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that very well. And one of the things that always comes up is that, you know, AOC is always, I'm always supposed to follow them on Twitter, and I always refuse. Like, I have this sort of like, why would I follow an American politician? I have this sort of visceral reaction to that. And I think you're right. They are being caricaturized as, they are being demonized by the right. I would say there is a characterization, but there's also a demonization that's happening there. And I think that I don't think I can speak specifically to either to Fauci, for example, because I don't think I follow them enough in the news and have thought about them individually in the news. But I think the practice of demonizing left figures is, again, I just keep coming back to this idea that it's rooted in that sort of what we broadly call evangelical Christianity. And I think you probably sense a frustration in me, right? I see that evangelical Christianity as having suffused Western pop culture, but it isn't ignored. And part of the reason it isn't ignored is because the left doesn't know what to do with religion. It doesn't have a language for speaking about it. You know, the left has bought rather uncritically into what some religious scholars call the secularization theory, which is that as we become more and more modern, we will become inevitably more and more secular. And when that doesn't happen, which it isn't happening, it's very clearly not happening, there is a sort of bemusement. So it's what I called head shaking or hand wringing. There's this sort of like, this doesn't make sense to me because it doesn't fit into my framework, but it does contribute then to this polarization, this tension that's ongoing. So I don't think I'm answering your question fully, but I'd love to discuss it more, because I think I'd love to hear more about how you think the right is looking at Fauci, and then how you feel consequently critical of somebody like Fauci, and how that, it's that feeling of squirming, right? There's sometimes when being on the left is a squirmy position. I think that's the best way I could say
it. Yeah, I don't know. I have a bunch of things to say about that, but I know I see Mike has his hand up as well. But let me think about that for a moment, and then I'll, maybe Mike, if you have a question.
Me too. I'll think about that too.
Sure. Thanks very much for this talk. I really appreciate it. It was really good. And I think something we all need to be talking about. One thing that I was glad that you raised at the end, the issues of death threats and white supremacy, which is like to me, like, obviously there's many different kinds of Covidiots, and the ones that we, and I think most folks make a distinction, even when they don't make it explicitly, between a kind of like somebody who's been a naturopath for a long time and the death threat white supremacist folks. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was that I in your discussion of religion, which I think is really welcome and necessary, I hear, though this could be wrong, a presumption of good faith on the part of, I'll put it in quotes, evangelical Christians. And what I mean to say is that like most of the evangelical Christians I know aren't really Christians. Like they would tell you that they are. But, you know, when I see them post things like, heaven has a wall too, in response to Trump's wall, right?
Yeah.
They've played their hand. And this is an old thing, like there's like sometimes right-wing Christians are more right-wing than Christian. And they actually go to church just to kind of practice their fascism and their white supremacy. And I see this, I know people who are like this. And another thing that I think is in the presumption of good faith, which is also kind of a left problem, right? Is that, for instance, that everybody's talking the same language. So for instance, if someone says, don't tread on me, a left-minded person thinks one ought not to tread upon one, right? that's what that statement means.
Yeah.
But to a lot of people, they mean don't tread on me. And we never heard from them before about freedom when 3% of the US population is incarcerated, and most of those are, and you know what I mean? Like, but you don't need me to recite all those things, but like all of a sudden now, and so to me, one of the things about that branch of Covidiot is almost the kind of arbitrariness of it, right? That this is just kind of it sort of, again, yeah, arbitrarily or almost randomly, this ended up being the kind of way to do these things.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to just ask you, like, is there a way of talking about religious people acknowledging that most of the time they're not religious, even if they would tell you that they are?
Yeah, I think there is. Just give me one second. I'm just gonna let my cat out of my room.
Why?
Just suddenly distracting me. Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think there is, and I think so. I did, evangelical Christianity is a way too broad of a category, and a lot of people, and it's become such an extruded category that people will call themselves evangelical Christians when essentially all they do, and I'm not being facetious here, essentially all they do is watch Fox News, right? Like that is their claim to evangelical Christianity. So I would say that there's many different types of evangelical Christianity, and as with all religions, there are things that gatekeep and characterize belonging to that religion. And I have not come across yet an evangelical church in which you can just watch Fox News and call yourself an evangelical Christian. So then the question becomes, what do we do with this huge category of people who call themselves evangelical Christians, who just watch Fox News, support Trump, and then become part of this, white supremacist group of people who will varyingly protest Black Lives Matters or, frankly, protest healthcare workers, right? So it's kind of the same group of people. And we have to have a way of talking about them. And I don't think that we can just dismiss the fact that they call themselves evangelical Christians, even though they aren't participating in church or in any of the mechanisms, nor do they belong to any particular evangelical faith. So they're not like the woman who was covered in blood in a church parking lot, right? They're not actually participating. They don't actually have a religious authority that they're deferring to. But it comes back to this idea, and I need to do more work on this, frankly. So thank you for your question, Michael. I think it comes back to the performance of identity, right? So they're performing identity. And I know, I want to go to Joan Scott's work on identity and performance to sort of look at this more. And I haven't really done that yet, but there's something there. There's something in performing that identity, and there's something in claiming that identity. And it is, I think, and again, I'm not sure how I'm going to get at this in terms of research, but I think it's linked to this idea of nostalgia, this idea of a simpler time that is very clearly connected to colonialism. So first of all, I know a lot of homeschooling moms in my area who, take a natural approach, and they're looking to go back to a simpler time. So a time away from screens for their kids. They don't want their kids having access to screens. The kids need to learn how to sew, and it's Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie. It is entirely what it is, and it is entirely uncritical. And you can find them on YouTube as well, right? So, or Instagram, or wherever you find homesteaders and homeschoolers and all that sort of stuff. And this is where evangelical Christianity, the performance of it, when all you do is watch Fox News or follow Trump, or maybe even go to a Trump rally, very often these people are activated simply through this identification, and it's not an identification that's linked to a particular community. So one of the reasons that I found Brian Lim's work on the gay Covidiots, and I find the Amish communities so interesting, is because to me they're a foil to this other sort of massive group of people who identify with I think, really strong cultural forces of nostalgia and evangelical Christianity, colonialism, but they are belonging to a community. They're very clearly linked to specifically, they have specific relationships with each other. So we know that during the, whatever it was, insurrection on the White House, that a lot of people just showed up because of social media posts, and that they had there's no relationship happening there that's like part of what we consider a tight-knit community. And I don't think I'm answering your question entirely, but I think there's something there. There's something in between the performance of identity and the experience of community that is worth exploring, and how people identify. And how that reinforces certain narratives of America, narratives of democracy, narratives of freedom, all of that kind of stuff. And then how it becomes inescapable. So one of the things I'm also interested in is, once you identify this way, how do you change your mind? How do you stop watching Fox News? How do you stop, it's hard, right? If that becomes your entire area of identification. And I mean, I think it makes me sound like I'm being sympathetic, but I think the same thing happens on the left too, right? It becomes hard to push against the virtual signaling of the left. It becomes hard to critique that because when you critique that, you undermine relationships and you undermine networks and all of that kind of stuff. So I think I'm just circling your question a little bit.
No, this is really good. I'm so fascinated. I can't wait to see the shape that this takes. And one of the things I wanted to, it just brought to mind as you were talking, I was thinking about Benedict Anderson's sort of older work now on nationalism, how he talks about one of the great paradoxes of nationalism is how motivating it is. People will give up their lives for it, generationally, and how, as he says, philosophically impoverished the concept is, right? And that's kind of where I was interested in talking about when hearing you talk about belief, was because we mean so many different things by that. Like sometimes we'll use the word belief to describe activity that we think must have belief behind it and is reported by the person to have belief behind it, but it's not what we normally mean when we say belief. For instance, that's the poor person who was cornered as with the Jesus talking about her Jesus. I remember that when that happened, and the Jesus blood, and it's like she's in her car, and it's a scary thing to have a camera in your face, and of course it's like, well, why do you have brakes on your car? Won't Jesus protect you? And all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I'll leave it here with one thing, which is what one thing that you brought to mind is, so often when we talk about culture and pop culture in particular, we kind of don't. I'll say we, but I'll just me. I don't think about Christian radio and Christian movies and that whole culture, right, that people can live in and not even really leave very much. And I wonder if there might be some fruitful how does self-representation work, not only in Fox and like the wicked people at Rebel Media, but also like just Christian radio, stuff like that. Anyway, thanks very much.
No, and I should mention too, there's this huge circulation of like movies by that, what was that guy? Cameron, somebody. Anyway, he was a Hollywood actor, and then he became.
He was on one of those family 80s sitcoms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then I say Fox News as a kind of shorthand, but then people are also consuming those movies and the radio and the music and all of that kind of stuff becomes part of that identification. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I see two hands. I have Victoria and Laura.
Thanks for the talk. The thing that really drew me actually to your talk was the idea that you were going to talk about take into account that inside that term Covidiot, I think it's absolutely a term worth looking at and seeing how it acts and does transactions actually. That you said at the beginning of the talk you published that you take this group to include a wide range of different kinds of people. And you've actually, the thing I enjoyed most about your talk is giving us the examples of those different kinds of people, including your friend who was destroyed by COVID and whose partner died because of COVID and so on. And there were two things I wanted to pick up on. One was the idea that you said at some point that for the Amish, the idea of dying alone in the hospital is just kind of just unthinkable in this isolation. And I'm wondering why we would think that only the Amish would think that this was an unbearable thing. And one of the things that I think I've been most struck by are those two things you've mentioned there. One is the elderly and sick dying by themselves, with maybe being allowed to talk onto a phone with their loved ones and dying alone. And the other one was just all these people who haven't had healthcare, and so there are these COVID deaths that are not about having COVID. So for me, it's like this is a very complicated kind of way in which, as citizens during a pandemic, that one can have so many different motivations. I think it's a problem to just reduce it to some kind of thing about the religious right. I just think that when you're looking at people on the streets through Europe, you know, you're saying you're talking about the North American idea, so you're talking about specific thing. But in fact, there's masses of people doing stuff in Europe and doing freedom stuff as well, and really arguing against lockdown. And I wanted to tie this back specifically to what you were saying about belief. And it just seems to me that we're being told all the time that things are science. And then it turns out that it's not about science, it's about belief, because science, it's not just that science is not a mapping of the objective world, but that maybe the scientific method is a good one. But the thing about the scientific method is it's meant to have radical skepticism at its core, so that when the experiment doesn't work out, you have to change your mind. So I don't hold scientists responsible for knowing ahead of time exactly what ought to happen at any given time. If the science itself evolves, that's one thing. But that to me, the most interesting thing is that at each moment, we are required to believe whatever the public health person tells us at the time. And I mean, I'm not really built to believe. I mean, I want somebody to show me that they know what they're talking about. And so we talk about science and the science of science and science. And then anybody who says there's some they withhold some belief from the science, they get put into this category. And it's been incredibly damaging, I think, because up until now, we've been able to talk about policy separate from disease. And somehow, and you mentioned this in your paper, that you know, we're listening to public health officials all the time. We're supposed to just believe them. And, you know, these are people we've never encountered before. And suddenly they're literally in charge of the micro details of our life. So your friend had his place opened, closed, his livelihood destroyed. The other thing in the States is that a lot of the people who are very doubtful about vaccines are in the Black population. And so in New York, one of the terrible things that's happening is the people who are now no longer part of public life are from the Black community, and not from other, because they actually have a lot of skepticism about public policy related to health, because they've been damaged in the past. So I think this stuff is very complicated. And I'm sorry that we moved right into this thing about, you know, white supremacy and I mean, everybody's involved in this thing. I mean, that seems to me such a minor issue in a way, trying to think about how this word Covidiot is used. When it came out from the beginning, as you say, people who hoarded toilet paper, who are quite different from a set of people who may or may not believe in vaccines or may not agree with lockdowns. But the word is just used as this umbrella term that comes to mean many, many different things depending on what you're talking about. And I think I really like the fact that you're looking at the term and trying to say, what's the efficacy of this term and what does it do to you and how is it? But I think then the reduction of that to a certain specific group, which we just characterize via stereotypes, is just going to, it seems as though, I'm sorry, I mean, it just seems as though that's very much part of what the culture war is, that it's sort of like you literally cannot hear that there may be an argument. I also thought you were talking about the idea of natural immunity as though stuff comes from nature. I thought the idea of natural immunity is in part people who are immune from having had COVID. Because in Canada, we don't recognize people who've had COVID as people who have immunity. So if you've had COVID, you still have to have the vaccine. And in many places in Europe and in North America, there's a recognition that if you've had COVID, you should be having your antibodies checked because you actually have, quote, natural immunity. Mm-hmm. And that's different from what one would call herd immunity, which is perhaps what you were talking about, or I don't know.
No,
I don't know.
I'm really interrogating the concept of nature and so like I said a couple of times, it's thank you so much for that. There's so much to unpack there, but I'm not interested in evaluating the science. It's just not my job, and I it's hard when you study this kind of stuff not to get sucked into sort of feeling like maybe you have a bit of authority to talk about the science. So I'm going to try to stay away from that. But I think to start with what you started with. So as I said, for the Amish, the idea of an elder dying alone in isolation is abhorrent. Well, it is similarly abhorrent for me. And I guess that's where this idea of empathy comes in. I did everything, including not seeing my father, who's 88, to make sure that he wouldn't, get COVID and end up in a hospital and end up dying alone. This was a huge fear of mine. And yet at the same time, the cure for that, for me as a good COVID citizen, was to essentially not see him, which is, I think there's a lot of contradictions in what we are being asked to do. And again, I'm not interested in deciding what's right or wrong in terms of the science. That's not my area of expertise, but I do think that you make a really good point about the fact that when we don't have the expertise to evaluate the science, we are asked to believe in the science, and that the science, as Sandra Harding says, it seems to constantly slip back into this discussion of absolutism. And I think that gets worse when science gets translated into policy, when science gets translated into public speech in all sorts of different ways. So I think it gets worse when, I think, as you said, radical skepticism is at the heart of science, and science is meant to be inquirying. And I think it probably does that really, really well. But the way in which we talk about the science is where I think we can make an intervention as critical cultural studies scholars. I think that's what we can look at. And I think the way we talk about the science is filled with contradictions. And I think it is entirely implicated and entirely complicit in the creation of good subjects and bad subjects when it comes to this pandemic. And like you said, I have my own set of feelings about this, but there's likely many, many deaths that can be attributed to COVID that are not COVID deaths. In other words, not deaths from the virus. And this isn't again about me evaluating the science or evaluating medicine, but it's about acknowledging the way in which science and medicine are implicated in a neoliberalist society that is making a series of decisions, right? We're making a series of decisions. The fact is, if people were getting COVID and dropping dead immediately on the street, and there was no strain on our medical system, then we would have a different set of responses. Our responses are because of the strain it puts on the medical system. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say, but it is something to remind ourselves of, because it's getting buried in the public discourse of science right now. It's getting ignored. So stopping the virus is the most important thing, or halting the future of the virus is the most important thing. But it's only important because of the neoliberal conditions that we live in, the way in which healthcare operates and is funded, the way in which we value life. And so one of the things that I find so difficult about my tattoo artist Damien's story is that it was such a forceful reminder that we are told to social distance, wear masks, get vaccinated to preserve life, while other people's lives are not being preserved. And there's a lot more I could say about that particular story that I don't feel comfortable sharing yet. But there's those deaths need to matter, and they particularly need to matter in an analysis that takes seriously what Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics, right? Which is that our society is built on death of all sort, and that we should really be paying attention as critical cultural studies scholars to the way in which death and care get talked about, which lives matter. I mean, you even see it in the way, I tried to find it for this talk and I couldn't, but there was like a reporter from one of the American networks who went into the hospital for somebody who hadn't gotten vaccinated and was dying of COVID, lying in a bed, dying of COVID, saying, "Why didn't you get vaccinated?" It was an unbelievably appalling moment. And the way in which those deaths are construed as like, you were a bad subject, you're going to be a bad subject on your deathbed, is really something I think we ought to be paying attention to as cultural studies scholars. So thank you for that.
It's worse than that, actually. It's that some people were saying, I hope those people just, I mean, they were wishing harm on people. It's one thing to say, you've made a choice, you believe in whatever you believe in, but to actually literally wish harm on other people because they have for whatever reason, they don't agree with you is kind of interesting. The thing about not about staying away from your parent, I think this is an incredibly complicated thing, because I know a number of very old people, and they've made their own, they've had to make their own decisions about what they've done. But if they had followed all the public advice, they would have been literally untouched by another human being for a year and a half now, as would many people. Anybody living on their own would be untouched by anyone else. And there's something incredibly weird about that. And also we have to be able to have discussions about where you put priorities, and can you say there's literally one factor and one factor alone that guides everything in society, no matter what the losses. I think the other thing is with younger people, I think what we've asked young people to give up is just extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary. And so, you know, and the debate about schools and masks and schools and vaccination of children, again, you're called a covidiot if you actually want to say, let's actually try to think about whether a pregnant woman should get a vaccine, and is this vaccine the same as other vaccines? And I'm with you, I'm not a scientist, and I don't want to talk about, but I'm really been surrounded by people who keep on telling me the science. I'm like, please don't tell me the science. I've heard these lines, and I want to sort of say, I don't have to be denying that there's something going on called COVID to be wondering about the validity of public policy. I mean, there's a public policy discussion that should happen, and there's other things. And then what you're addressing is a whole other very important thing, which is about how are we interpolating other people? How are we describing other people because they disagree with us? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I link it back to Bob Orsi's discussion of plural ontologies, right? Or the idea that what he actually talks about is different worlds, that we inhabit different worlds. And I think that's a really interesting thing to then map onto this sort of, you know, what we're talking about now as a culture war, right? So what do we do with these different worlds? How do we communicate across them? And how do we act across them? Because, you know, supposedly living in this democracy, which is a term I certainly am hoping to problematize, we are expected to address issues of shared concern in the public sphere. That's what a democracy is supposed to do. Well, how do we do that when we have these really divergent beliefs that are out there, and that we're constantly thrown information on which we are? So what I find interesting, this whole thing started as like me feeling a bit squirmy about the idea that Covidiots are falling for misinformation. And as a communication studies scholar, I find the term misinformation problematic. And so this is where this sort of emerged from, is like, what counts as information and what counts as misinformation, and who's the gatekeeper of those two things, right? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there in how misinformation and belief gets mapped onto good subjects or bad subjects. And, you know, I think it's interesting that, you know, racialized subjects who are suffering higher rates of death and illness from COVID, even if they do everything right, still get construed as sort of bad pandemic. Well, it must be because you're obese, right? And that must be the reason, right? It must be your fault in some way. And and obesity, right, is very much constructed as a personal failure in our society. So I think that is significant, that you can have people who really act like Covidiots and therefore are bad pandemic subjects. They really aren't doing what has been the agreed upon method of dealing with this pandemic. But then you get people who do everything right, who still get categorized that way in really interesting ways.
There's another interesting development here, which has to do with the fact that in this particular period, there's meant to be a compliance with authority that, I mean, you know, we're generations that actually didn't think you should unquestionably accept authority, like that your premier says you should do this or you should do that, and that's what you do, or your prime minister says don't do this and don't do that, you know, and that's we're not just supposed to follow it because it's the law. That's one thing, but we're also literally supposed to embrace it as the right thing. And if we say maybe that's not a good idea, so this is a new kind of thing, a new kind of compliance, which has to do with regulation, where in fact you're talking about these incommensurable views that people have, but now some people are just told to shut up. If you don't agree with this, just shut up. Which is also that's not about public sphere. Public sphere is meant to be a place of this pluralistic possibilities that you might actually tolerate the fact that somebody's going to disagree with you and say so.
Yeah. There's that, for those of you who are on Facebook, there's that little thing that you can put over your profile picture that says, I'm anti-authoritarian or something. No, I question authority, but I got vaccinated. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely there. Good. Joshua?
Just as maybe a point of conclusion, my family in Alberta did a different one on Facebook, which is called ivermectin for life.
I like that one.
Yeah.
So that doctor I showed, Dr. Patrick Phillips,
right.
He was prescribing ivermectin as one of the reasons he was censored.
Yeah. I just by maybe way of conclusion too, I mean, this is such a fascinating area of research. And I mean, I think it speaks to the complexity of this term and how it circulates. Because I mean, for example, you talked about the healthcare, the health food people who are like, we want to see your face, we don't want to see your mask or whatever. And that sort of reminds me of a barber who I no longer see, who is like, queer and, Vietnamese, and was like, if you've had a vaccine, don't come.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's my tattoo artist is now at that point. But yeah. What I find is interesting is that he didn't start out that way, right? So like this, so in our effort to create good pandemic citizens, we seem to be, I'm going to put this in big quotation marks, we seem to be radicalizing people, right? Like, so he started out pretty moderate. He's not part of the Christian right. He's not a white supremacist. He's definitely involved in the queer community. And yet now he's sort of doing all of those sort of hard things. Like, I don't want to tattoo anybody who's gotten vaccinated. And it didn't start out that way. So I think that's really significant and interesting. Like, we want to pay attention to those movements, I think.
For sure. Well, I mean, we're at 9 o'clock, so I think we should probably conclude unless there's further questions from students, or I think we might be okay. Wow, this has been such an amazing talk. Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was great.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me again. Like I said, I'm always pleased to be around cultural studies folks.
We're pleased to be around you. Okay, great. Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.